to the New America Foundation. My name is Michael Calabrese. I am Vice President here and work closely with our Next Social Contract initiative, which is hosting this event, which asks the question, should the U.S. mandate private pension saving? And we're going to particularly look at some lessons learned from Australia's mandatory pension system, the superannuation system, as they call it, and they'll explain. The Australians here will explain, why that is and how it came about, and sort of how it's beating the pants off the rest of the world as far as building nest eggs for the future. And we're lucky enough. In fact, the impetus for this event is having two of the founders of the superannuation movement in Australia here in the United States and visiting Washington. So we asked them to come and share. And it was a great timing, too, because in the UK, Parliament is in the sort of the final rounds of approving a very similar system, which Pamela Perrin from Aspen Institute will describe to you. And this is a very it's kind of a nice symmetry here, because as far as getting a lot out of this, because not only in this event can we learn the lessons of Australia and what the UK is up to, but then our other two panelists, Jane White from Retirement Solutions, has a proposal for the United States that's modeled very much on the Australian experience, and Pamela Perrin has a proposal of her own, which is modeled very much on what the UK is doing, which in turn is similar to Australia. So there's this real trend, at least in the Anglo countries, toward mandatory defined contribution saving systems, which is a real challenge for the United States, which I'm sure, as everyone knows, has historically had a voluntary pension system. And that's part of the kind of one of the problems, which, although in this election year it's being eclipsed by the health coverage issue, which is probably an even more pressing concern, it's well known that Americans are not saving nearly enough. In fact, just in 2005, we had a real milestone, which was a year when net personal savings was actually negative for the first time since 1933, which was, of course, the depths of the Great Depression. We do best when it comes to retirement saving. In fact, we actually have more retirement saving each year than we have net personal saving, because people put money in the retirement accounts and then they borrow on credit cards and elsewhere. So you might say that pensions are how America saves. But the real problem, of course, is that it's how many people save, but not how all of us do. In other words, in fact, the minority of workers are covered by employer-sponsored pension plans, either of the defined benefit, the traditional defined benefit type, or the new 401k defined contribution types. Only about 40, I think it's the number, something like 46% of the workforce participates in any employer plan. That's a little better, a little over 50% for full-time workers, but really the coverage is really only half. So about 75 million Americans have no access to the easy, automatic, and subsidized saving that you get with a good 401k plan. As a result, 40% of today's boomers are on track right now to save less than, to have retirement savings that will replace even half of their pre-retirement income. And as a result, there were projections of, a few years ago that today's boomers will be as dependent on Social Security as today's over 70 generation is. And that's quite dependent. In fact, 40% of today's retirees over 70 are almost entirely dependent on Social Security. And that will hold true once again for the current generation of older workers at the rate we're going. So just before I bring up Mavis and then Gary, I would just want to mention one of the handouts out there is actually a little bit different than this mandatory trend, which is the New America proposal for a universal 401k, which I actually began advocating about 10 years ago, even before I came to New America, and which we've been talking about, which is actually not a mandatory saving proposal, although it would be universal. And just to tell you about that for 1 minute, which is that, our proposal has been that we essentially provide what would be a good employer 401k to all workers, to the other half that don't have access and don't participate in employer plans. And the way that would work is essentially in three components, which I think you'll hear mirrored in these mandatory plans as well. What I call the 3 I's: incentives, infrastructure, and inertia. The incentives really is that we need a strong matching incentive for saving. So today, the tax incentives for retirement saving are completely upside down. Higher income, very affluent workers receive the equivalent of 35 cents on the dollar subsidy from the government in the form of a tax deduction, but the bottom 40%, again, that same 40%, right, that's not saving, that will be dependent on Social Security, receive nothing at all, because the tax deduction is worthless if you're in the bottom brackets. It's very different than what would be a refundable tax credit that everyone would get regardless of income. And so what we need is like a good 401k plan, a government match that is refundable and deposited into your account. Second is infrastructure. Again, as I said, one of the big things that keeps people saving is automatic payroll deduction into an account that's managed for you professionally. Half the workforce doesn't have that, and so what we have in a universal 401k is automatic payroll deduction and low-cost account administration in a system similar to what the federal employees have through their thrift savings program. And finally, inertia. We need to convert myopia into positive inertia by making participation in the savings system the default option. And so this involves automatic enrollment, and then once you're enrolled, although you could opt out, and that's the voluntary part, automatic investment, because many plans, even if you don't make a choice, they'll put you in the most conservative, but we need to have kind of life cycle investment or asset allocation so that you earn a good return. And then finally, automatic annuitization. Again, unless you affirmatively opt out, that after retirement you get paid your payments, in a monthly stream for life, like a traditional pension plan, rather than in a lump sum that's much more likely to leak out into spending. So, with that in mind, which we've framed as a voluntary thing, I think we here at New America are actually debating whether we should add a mandatory component to that universal 401k, and so we're very interested to hear the lessons from Australia as well as the proposals by Jane and Pamela. So first I'll bring up Mavis Robertson. Mavis has been associated with the development of industry superannuation in Australia since the early 1980s and has served on many boards related to this, most notably CBUS, the industry fund for the construction and building industries, where she has been at various times a trustee, fund secretary, CEO, and chair. She is one of the founders of various industry bodies, including the Conference of Major Superannuation Funds, the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees, and several others that most Americans can't relate to, but essentially put her at the epicenter of this whole system in Australia. Maybe.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure that you don't think that I'm also here selling real estate. I'm technologically very incompetent, and this was going to be the first slide to go up because I want to really begin by just giving you a little picture of how retirement works and is funded in Australia, and of which superannuation is a key part, but only one part. People all have some kind of personal assets and personal savings, and in Australia the most important one has been the home or the flat or whatever it is that people buy in a lifetime, and that has been a key part of retirement savings and retirement benefits, actually, because if you own the place where you live, you can manage much better than those who can't. And that's there really just to illustrate that Australia is not immune from the craziness in the housing markets, and this is based on a true, real house in Williamstown in Victoria, where a modest little house actually, that has gone, as it were, to a point where the next generation will be in very great difficulty to be like most Australians in retirement now. About 80% of them actually own their own house, and that's going to make a big difference in the future. So that's the reason that's there, but it's going to stay there till I get to the next one, because if I press the wrong thing, I'll be selling you something else. The second thing I do want to just say something about is the age pension in Australia, because when we talk about it to people such as this audience, most people will say, oh, that's like our social security. Well, it is sort of, but it's not exactly like that. It's paid out of the annual budget each year, and it's a fixed amount in the sense that it's there's a bipartisan position in the Parliament for 25% of average weekly male earnings being paid to the vast majority of retirees. But it is means tested. It's a very generous means test. At the present time, about 82% of all retirees receive the age pension in whole or in part. 25% of average weekly earnings works out at something like $14,000 a year. $14,000 a year, and if you're a couple, you get something a little less, not very much less, but it's worked on the basis that two presumably live more cheaply than one. And one of the deficiencies of this system shows up when a couple who don't manage to die on the same day turn out to be one person, because that one person then finds it very difficult to live on the single 25%, because it still costs you just as much to heat your house or cool your house or all those other things, and is one of those things that the present government is reviewing in terms of the whole taxation system, but also the retirement system. But it does work pretty well alongside what has been there incipiently since 1984, and that is the system of superannuation, as we call it. And basically, I think that you need to understand that by the 1980s, most people that I knew, because I am a female, didn't have any superannuation, and we had all these ridiculous sort of laws, especially in the public service. And if you were a teacher, the day that you married, you had to resign from the system, but of course they needed you, but they took you back as a full-time casual, but you no longer had any superannuation rights. And all sorts of people had all kinds of horrible experiences, actually, with the superannuation system as it then existed. Most company funds gave very generous benefits to management, but some workers would be on a different scale, or most workers were not on any scale, and nothing was portable, and people really had a quite bad view, I think, of their experience. I mean, you could see it like this. At the time, in the early 80s, about 39% of people working had some access to superannuation. But now, at the present time, almost 30 years later, only 12% of people who are retirees in Australia are fully funded themselves. So it didn't work for most people. People gave up their benefits because they went and took another job and so on. And so no one was very keen on superannuation, but out of some circumstances it became possible for the Australian Council of Trade Unions to start a campaign which carried out, and Gary will talk to you more about this, that it came through over a 10-year period, much of which was quite difficult to achieve and was a matter of activity, even struggle, much hard work to raise the number of people who had some coverage from that 39% to around about 80%. And at that stage, most of what was being done by the unions was not opposed by the then Labor government. One could say they supported it by not opposing it. But by the end of that decade, they were able to, I think it's called courage, to legislate for a compulsory system. And that compulsory system has existed since 1992. And it began with a 3% contribution, which was about what people had been receiving when they'd won some right to superannuation in the 80s. And part of the legislation was a chart which showed over a 10-year period how that 3% would increase. It increased more slowly for small employers than it did for large employers, and it became 9% by 2002. So it's not altogether, I would say, an amount that everyone would agree is adequate, and it was intended by the Labor government to actually, through tax concessions and individual contributions, because there were no individual contributions, these are all employer contributions, would move to 15%, but that was actually not proceeded with when the government changed. Now, I'm sure you're really sick of looking at the housing thing, so I'm going to press this and see what happens. Oh, yes, so here you are. We had, of course, and we do have, a system that includes much more than the funds that I'm most interested to talk to you about. Because in the course of winning superannuation and then, having the mandatory system, the big thing that Australia has is industry funds for more than 50% of the workforce. And industry funds are jointly trusteed funds established primarily in the first place by the unions and the Australian Council of Trade Unions, but now supported very widely by employer organisations, and the joint trusteeship is half for the representatives coming from the union side or coming directly from the members, and half from the employer organisations, and including the main employer organisations. And to ensure that these did not become a battleground for other issues, that most of these funds in their joint trusteeship require a 2/3 majority for decision making. And they, we used to call them not-for-profits, but some of our marketing research showed us that a lot of our members think that if you're a not-for-profit, that you're not really working hard. And so basically, I suppose I tend to call them now, and others call them various variations of this, that they're superannuation funds where all the profits go to the members. And that's the point about that slide there. If there was always personal superannuation in Australia before this system became mandatory, and some of those morphed into kind of retail products, which they even, I think, in a complementary way, try to look a little like industry funds. But the big difference is the fees and commission charges that get associated with them, and particularly by those who recommend those funds. And to show you that we don't live in a very fair society any more than you do, that over a 10-year period, the top 10 performing funds, 8 of them are industry funds. One of them is a fund of a former government enterprise now privatised, and one is a retail fund. But if you care to go to financial planners or accountants to seek advice as to which fund you should be in, you will never be offered an industry fund. The industry funds network is actually is as big as it is, in part because of the workplace organising by unions and by the superannuation funds themselves. And it is absolute madness that in a compulsory system that people have to pay commissions to get their money into the fund that they're in. So the issue, I suppose, that I stress most of all to you is that I think the unique thing that has made the superannuation system work as well as it does in Australia is the existence of the industry funds. And if you take the industry funds plus the public sector funds, which are also all profits to members, and the few corporate funds that are still in existence, then more than 70% of Australians are outside of that little bit of ripping off. And I know that some people say that you get better advice or you pay extra for these things because you need more choice of investment. And for the overwhelming majority of people, this is simply untrue. Most people in industry funds have the choice of about 5 or 6 investment vehicles, but overwhelmingly they choose what is often known as the trustee's choice, the balance fund, and that basically is what most people want. And if you do want to sort of, I don't know, change your investments every second day and guess the market and do whatever you want to do, it's actually able to be accommodated even in industry funds, but you need to pay for it because there's not the same idea that you can cross-subsidise. But what are the key features for industry funds? The first is that it is compulsory, that the employers have to pay. The second is that it is a jointly trusteed system. Not necessarily in order, but very important to those who have remembrances of being in funds where it took 5 to 10 years before they actually were entitled to anything. It's fully vested from day one. It's portable, and that's absolutely essential in the terms of the labour market in Australia. I think the same with you, that people do change their jobs quite often and even change their careers. There's reporting compulsorily on investment results over 10, 5, 3 and 1 year, with the aim of encouraging understanding that superannuation is a long-term investment. I don't know that we're altogether successful about that because constantly, of course, the financial press and other media is telling you what went up and what went down this week, last week and so on. There's an accessible disputes resolution process. There's some choice of investment options, as I've told you. Related party investment is severely restricted. Borrowing from a member's account is not allowed, but there are opportunities to access part of a member's funds if he or she has been out of work for more than 6 months and requires assistance to make mortgage payments on the family home or in general meet some serious crisis, but basically the benefits are preserved until people retire. I'll just give you a little snapshot now of the types of fund that exist in Australia. Currently, well, maybe not currently because we've been away a few weeks and the market's been going down. In Australia, the funds represent 1.2 trillion in assets. That's pretty large in Australian terms, as is a country of 22 million people. Of this, 450 billion in the assets is managed by the all profits to members sector. 377 billion is in the retail sector, and that's the sector that is most similar to 401k plans. They're still getting an increasing share out of the compulsory superannuation system. 300 million is in self-managed funds. There's also an increasing share, and this is one of the growth areas, which is a bit sad actually. You'll excuse me saying this, but I think it's mainly hairy-chested men between the ages of about 35 and 45 who are sort of sold the idea that they're better able to organise their money than anybody else. And often they do quite well in the first couple of years, but really after a couple of years they end up with a fair bit of their money in cash. Within the not-for-profit sector, there broadly are three categories of funds. Industry funds have assets of 204 billion and it's an increasing share. Public sector or government funds have 181 billion and that's flat or declining. And the corporate one company funds have only 71 billion now and declining. So, and as I've said, 70% of all superannuation fund members are in the not-for-profit sector, of which more than 50% are in industry funds. I don't want to, at this stage, talk to you about the difference between DC and DB funds in Australia. I just want to say that people who have DB funds in this country and elsewhere want to sort of hang on to what they've got, and that's very understandable. And I think that it was managed pretty well in Australia, where you can preserve the benefits for people, but once you have a mandatory system, for everybody else, there's somewhat like an equal playing field. I just want to conclude, and I don't know what's going to be on this one. These are actually some of the figures that I'm telling you here, and this comes under the heading of the best performing funds. I've told you about the best performance in investment, but a very recent survey has been completed by the regulators in Australia, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and this research confirms that in the 10 years period from 1996, the not-for-profit sector outperformed the retail funds by 2 to 3% per annum. This adds up to one of the slogans that we use in the industry funds, a lifetime of difference in retirement benefits. The research gives a very big tick to the jointly trusteed system, and I have left a copy of that report, and that's not done by people who are necessarily very friendly towards industry funds, but I think adds to the view that this is a pretty good success story. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavis. Now we have Mavis's colleague in the superannuation movement, Gary Weaven. Gary is chair of Industry Funds Management, which is a leading investment service provider to the superannuation industry. He's also a director of Members Equity Bank, which is owned by 40 superannuation funds, and Pacific Hydro, a world leader in renewable energy. I think probably what's most relevant in Gary's, because I won't read it all, but what's most relevant in Gary's background is that back in the late 1980s, kind of the culmination of a career in the labour movement in Australia, Gary was elected Assistant Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, so making him the #2 official, and in that capacity, he helped to get this compulsory system, started, which, as Mavis told you, began, with the union movement, which was about 40% of the workforce at that time, and really gave it the critical mass to be extended after that. So, Gary?
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Well, it's always impossible in international fora such as this for people to understand all of the various models in detail, and it's not necessary either, I don't think. So what I want to do is just go through the major positives and negatives of the Australian system as I've seen it after a virtual lifetime of involvement, because I think if we can focus on those key issues, that will be of most help to you. There's one thing I just wanted to make clear in terms of Mavis's presentation, which she talked about the age pension system vis-a-vis the social security system. In fact, while it does have quite a lot of similarities, I think the biggest difference to me, in my understanding at least, of your system is the age pension does not actually depend on work. It does not depend on working time contribution. It is funded from the public purse for each citizen, not in relation to what work they've done or what contributions they've made. So in simple terms, come age 65, you are entitled to it subject to a test on your income and a test on your assets, and the family home's exempted from the assets test. So I wanted to, I was quite happy with the slide that promoted industry super funds, because that's my special love too, but I'm not going to use that at all. I just want to go through these key advantages. First of all, the key positives that I see. And the first one that I see is actually compulsion. And I listened carefully to what Michael said, and I think that system is the second best, where you have an opt-out compulsion or a default arrangement. But I think in actual fact, no system will work adequately without compulsion. And so in Australia, almost all employees are automatically covered. If you're on a very, very small or part-time wage, you may not be. That's a mistake too. But I think the experience in Australia and many other countries is that it is simply not efficacious to attempt to create long-term savings through tax incentives. For many people, particularly those on low or middle incomes, and as well as younger people, of course, there is no effective tax incentive you can offer them to forego immediate consumption. Because if they think, well, the option is I'll get a tax break on this if they don't change the rules by the time I'm entitled to this at age 65. Who's going to believe a government is not going to tinker with the system? No one. Secondly, people, if you're a low-income person, you have very much immediate needs. Your food and shelter, and perhaps trying to buy a home, pay your rent. And so what happens, of course, is tax incentives goes to the people who can afford it. People who can afford to put money aside, get all the tax breaks. And so I think I just would not start from the proposition of anything other than a system that requires universal coverage and is all-inclusive. The data historically shows that hugely favourable tax incentives don't get the rate of coverage up significantly. In fact, what actually happens, I think, is that the tax incentives simply don't increase savings either, because rich people, or people that are well off, simply switch their savings from a less tax-preferred regime to a more tax-preferred regime. And the net national savings tend not to increase at all. The second positive about the Australian system is that the contributions that are made are vested in the name of each employee. And it's a simple point, but it can't be overestimated. When an employee gets twice a year a statement, or once or twice a year a statement telling them what the status is of their retirement benefits, it is like an investment account. It shows the amount of money that is now accrued in their name and that belongs to them. Even though they can't get their hands on it, until age 65. In normal circumstances, it belongs to them. It shows the earnings that have been added to it. It shows the cost of administration that's come out of it. So, not always clearly in some of the retail funds, but that's another story. So the employee's benefit, therefore, is not dependent on the behaviour or prosperity of any one employer or government. It's not dependent on that. It is dependent on how well the money is invested, obviously. The third positive is that the employer levy, that there is an employer levy, that is the basis of this, and that the employer levy was phased in. So, of course, initially, when, first of all, by industrial relations bargaining, and then later on by legislative mandate, employers were required to make a contribution, of course that was unpopular with many employers. And of course there was a lot of controversy and a lot of dire predictions about what would happen to this money that anyone other than them had control of in the future. But you have to remember it was also very popular with employees, because from the employees' point of view, and voters, of course, point of view, someone else was paying for it. That is, the employer was paying for it. To a lesser extent, it was also quite popular with some employers, all those employers who were already paying more, as much or more than they were required, because what they saw is at last there's a levelling up of the competitive basis. In the area of my competition as an employer, finally I'm not the only one who's paying, my competitors are paying. The phasing in from 3% to 9% over 10 years meant that everyone had time to actually adjust to that new regime. And it was a level playing field for employers. Establishing that 9% in advance, though, in the legislation, setting it down day one that ultimately we're going to 9%, was really politically important, because it meant you didn't have to keep regulating or legislating. It was there. You took the hit, the controversy, the debate once you had the numbers to pass that through the Parliament, you could actually do it. The next point, fully funded. The US debate around this defined benefit versus defined contributions, to us is largely a red herring. Clearly, people can't receive benefits over and above what is contributed, plus fund earnings, unless they're across subsidies. So the real issues are not the form of the scheme. The real issues is who's paying, how secure is the funding. You know, will the funding continue? Who's covered, or more importantly, who's not covered, and who owns the funds? Who actually owns the funds? And the Australian system seeks to provide for all employees to own their share of the fund through the trustee. And while the employer is the primary source of funding, clearly the community as a whole ultimately shares that cost. And they share that cost through the market economy, because all employers are included. All employers are passing on the costs in prices, so everyone is actually paying their share across the whole community. But initially, the employees see it as a benefit. The next point is that the private sector is actually fully involved. You know, initially our Labor movement had a policy that'd be one government-run pension for everyone. On top of the age pension, there'd be another for everyone, and this would be great. Well, I've got to say, I think it would have been very bad, because there would have been one master, the political whims of the day would determine it, the investment policies, no competition, not a good idea. So because the system is primarily delivered through licensed trustees, so each trustee body for each fund is licensed and charged with protecting and maximising the members' interests, there's significant outsourcing to multiple service providers for investment, for administration, for insurance and all other services. So accordingly, there's competition both between superannuation funds themselves in terms of trying to get better performance, but also between the service providers that they hire, that are trying to get hired by the trustees of the funds. And there is really quite healthy competition, but far from perfect competition, and I'll come back to that later. The next point is strong not-for-profit sector. The system was forced to specifically recognise industry funds as a category because they mushroomed in the 1980s as a result of union campaigns and employer association responses to those campaigns. So Mavis has mentioned the coverage of all of that. All of these funds, though, in the not-for-profit sector, overwhelmingly outsource their services to service providers. And Mavis has mentioned performance. The performance over every period you want to mention is very, very markedly in favour of the not-for-profit sector and industry funds against the commercial sector. And that's both due to lower costs and no sales commissions paid, and also due to better investment performance. And, you know, the real irony is, you know, if you go to someone calling themselves an advisor or an accountant, they're not required to act in your interest. Under the law at the moment, that's a major problem. And, of course, because they don't get paid a commission from a public sector fund or an industry fund, they don't ever recommend the best funds. Simple as that. Benefits preserved to retirement, we've covered. Growing pool of national savings. You know, obviously, Australia has similar issues about trade deficits and so on, as the States actually. And notwithstanding a commodities boom at the moment, we have a chronic trade deficit. And the great thing about compulsory savings is that it is money not in people's hands to spend on consumption, which means imports. It is there for long-term use of retirees. And that means, of course, also a very big positive for healthcare, because we all know that the great majority of health costs occur in retirement age. And so we do have a highly subsidised universal healthcare system as well. Not a perfect system, but a lot better system than here, but it's a big positive. Now let me quickly just talk about the negatives, and these are relatively few, but there are some. There's probably too many schemes. The number has come down from thousands and thousands and thousands down to 580 schemes of the basic trustee provided type, but unfortunately there's a mushrooming of self-managed funds, 380,000. Again, they are largely sold through the commission-driven advice system. So they're not, you know, it may be hairy-chested men, and in that age category, I'm well outside that age category anyway, Mavis, but don't suffer from those delusions, you know. But it is partly true that people think they can do better, but it is also partly true, largely true, that they get sold this through accountants and commission planners and advisors. And it is the worst performed sector and will continue to be. It was also largely, people saw it as a means of getting around the rules, avoiding tax and other scrutiny. You can't effectively scrutinise 380,000 schemes. And so the real lesson here is there must be a high degree of competition, but competition can have its downside too, and sometimes it's better to regulate and make sure that the system is properly regulated. Commission-based selling, I think I've covered that enough. The lack of clear standards is a bit of a problem. If we were starting from scratch rather than building a system on top of an already existing system which had developed in an ad hoc manner, exactly like yours has, if we were starting from a blank sheet of paper, you would do things differently. You would, for example, I think, lay down at the very start some very, very clear standards about how people can express their fees, how they're allowed to structure fees so that they're clear and everyone understands them. How everyone reports performance, you know, there'd be very clear rules that you must report 10-year performance, 5-year performance, you must report it in a certain way. There's a lot of room for much greater clarity in standards to make the market work better and make the competitive system. We have a so-called employee choice system. It was largely introduced as a means of the previous Conservative government believing it would be the death knell of industry funds. It's turned out not to work. We're still increasing our market share. But it is in any case quite a restricted system, where mainly it is very hard for an employee to choose in most cases because of the paperwork, and the employer nominates the default fund, or it can be overridden by collective agreements and so on. So that's the major positives and negatives. I also have left it, and I'll stop now because I know we want dialogue after the next presenters. I've left a one-pager also, though, in addition to those notes. I've left a one-pager somewhere at the back of the room, I think, which is the conditions favourable to establishment or reform of a retirement savings system as they existed in Australia in the 1980s and the conditions in the USA today. And I think the situation is that there's quite a lot of similarity, but there are some very favourable circumstances, mainly to do with the way in which the labour movement was organised and regulated, industrial relations were regulated in the 80s, that don't exist today. But on the other hand, the need today, it seems to me, in the US is much clearer than it was then. The task, the imperative is getting stronger and stronger as every year goes by. And so with the right political will, I think, the message can prevail. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. I also want to actually mention that my colleague Phil Longman, I was passing a note earlier, he won't be able to make it due to a family emergency this morning. Next is Jane White, who is president of Retirement Solutions, which promotes adequate retirement saving and best practices for 401k type saving plans. Jane is also a former financial journalist, and I've known her for quite some time, since I served on the board of Retirement Solutions earlier. And she has a white paper and proposal which you can actually find, download and link to on the web page for this event, which you can find on the homepage of New America Today. Jane?
Thanks, Michael. And Gary, I apologize for imposing my PowerPoint on you. I'm technologically inept. I wanted to make sure it was there. Now, bear with me, folks, while I try to reverse the slide order here.
Yeah, I want to.
Am I going the wrong way? Yes. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Just had to get comfortable with my PowerPoint here. Like a lot of reformers, I decided that this year should be the year for bringing reform to 401k plans. It's a presidential election. We're all excited about change and hopeful and knocking on wood. And I decided to look at the best DC, because I'm a DC advocate, plans in the world, and got a hold of the OECD's national report that they put out yearly, I believe, called Pensions at a Glance. And in that, I was most impressed with the Australian. There are, I believe, 8 DC schemes in the world, of which 7 are mandatory. Guess who's the exception? And this next slide should illustrate one of the major differences. And I just went the wrong way. I am really talented. Okay, Jane, just keep holding on to it.
Do the right one.
I'll just keep it in my hand. On the top here, you see a report that was issued by AMP Financial Services, I believe it's a mutual fund company, saying that the average Australian is looking at a nest egg of $500,000. Now, Mavis and I both joked earlier that average is not a good statistic to use. As we all know, when Bill Gates walks into a bar, the average income goes up, the median income does not. But that's the best number I could get a hold. The lower figure of 110,000 is the amount of money that Americans in the age 62 to 65 bracket have, and that would be 401k balances and rollover IRA balances. Any way you look at it, it's a big difference, and we've got to make sure that we've got more heading in the Australian direction. The major difference, what I like the most, is not only is the system compulsory, it's the amount, the percentage of the employee's salary that needs to be contributed to the account. 9%, and that compares to 3% in the US. And that 3%, as we all know, is not mandatory. Small plans typically have no match at all. Yeah, and this was the slide that was hanging around here. Every Australian is not on track, as Mavis and Gary pointed out. Did the 9% go in 2002? I know it was phased in, but Obviously, the boomers are the ones who are taking the least advantage of it because they haven't been in the system as long. However, a huge difference between our plan and theirs is that the government is saying, hey, let's help you guys actually catch up and be on track. So the following chart highlights some major differences between our systems. As I mentioned to Mavis, I did run this by the Australian Tax Authority, so I hope it's pretty accurate. As I mentioned, 9%, and look at the salary ceiling. That's pretty high, $137,000. Here, it's optional. Government contribution, and I think this is actually very similar to what you're proposing, Michael, for your universal 401k. I think that it's aimed primarily at the lower paid, and again, that's on top of their aged pension. We've got nothing. Over 50, and if this isn't the most glaring difference, I don't know what is. 100,000, 450,000 over 3 years. I guess they're continually tweaking that, as opposed to $5,000 here, and of course that $5,000 rises with inflation. But come on, so next year it's $5,500. Give me a break. Who isn't covered? Virtually the only people who aren't covered in Australia are part-timers, who will eventually be full-timers and then get covered. Here, 70 million Americans. Tax treatment of contributions, 15%. Now, the ironic thing about this whole Republican, oh, we're going to give you taxes incentives. Well, the problem with the tax incentive in the workplace is that you're deferring taxes to when you retire. I mean, we all know what senior citizens discounts are. Senior citizens can't afford to pay taxes, especially when they are living on empty nest eggs. In Australia, you can also contribute to a spouse's account if the spouse has either no or low income, and I don't know how low income is defined, but in any event, no such deal here. Now, Australia is not the only country that's putting ours to shame. In the other countries that have mandatory DC accounts, virtually all of them are more generous than ours, including Mexico, 6.5% of pay. And if we're talking about coverage, and this is, I think, DB and DC combined, more of the population is covered, 90%, and I'm presuming the other 10% are probably part-timers and so on and so forth, right? So self-employed, okay? So, you know, there we are, way down the bottom. What went wrong? Well, the problem is twofold. DB plans pretty much took off after World War II. We were a fortress economy, there was a wage freeze, and pensions and health care were a way to, you know, compete for the workforce. The other problem is that we had pension reform. And the problem with reforming a system, even if your intentions are good, if it's putting too much shackles on the employers, you know, you have contribution holidays that force people to not be in the bull market. Hello? You know, the PBGC premiums going up. The employers just say, the hell with it, I'm out of here. And that's, I think, a great deal of the reason, along with global competition. I'll cede to that a little bit. But 17% is the number right now of the population that's covered by a DB plan. So the problem is, if you're only covered by a 401k plan, the 3% contribution rate of the employer shifts the burden of funding your retirement onto you. Sure, stock market returns provide, you know, a lot of that, but still. In conjunction with pensionary actuary James Turpin, because I may know math, but not that kind of complicated math, I said, so what's the deal? How much would you have to contribute to a 401k plan to achieve a nest egg similar to a defined benefit nest egg? I use the formula 10 times final. Those of you who aren't actuaries are going to go, what the hell are you talking about? But 10 times final is a nest egg that's equivalent to 10 times your salary at retirement or the last 3 years or whatever. And in order to do that, you would have to save 10% of your income, assuming you start at age 25. And I bet there's probably 100 people in the country who start saving in their 20s at that rate, if that many. And as you can see, that rate escalates to 48% at age 50, making the notion of $5,000 catch-up contributions all the more absurd. So Our six-point solution require most employers who do not also have a DB plan or whose DB plan is frozen to future accruals to do the Australian thing with a 9% contribution rate. Exempt would be small companies, new companies. We believe in entrepreneurship, but after a while, maybe if you've been in business 5 years, it's like, okay, buddy, you got to offer a plan. Define the contribution rate necessary by the employee as well, because even with the 9%, I believe you encourage and communicate to your citizens that they've got to kick in their share. Got to have more generous contributions for those over age 50, and I didn't go into this in great detail, but access to vested balances when changing jobs, this is a tragedy. 40% of Americans who change jobs cash out of their 401k plans. They're not only depriving that money of investment returns, the only person who makes out like a bandit is Uncle Sam, because they're paying tax on that, they're paying penalty tax on top of it. The last thing, prohibit annuity sellers from marketing the product for those with inadequate savings. And I just got to be on my bully pulpit for a minute, because the only thing more aggravating than the fact that nobody's talking about the retirement crisis is that we have the people in the financial services industry who are selling annuities to people who don't have enough money. The purpose of an annuity is to make adequate nest egg last a lifetime. It cannot make a sow's, you know what that thing, sow's silk, I don't know. I'm bad with jargon. So in conclusion, I believe the structure of the 401k plan is good because it's portable. If the average American has 8 jobs during a lifetime, you can virtually never be vested in a DB plan. We also probably need to change the vesting rules for DC because we still got a problem. I believe that in Australia, as soon as you start working, I don't know whether, if you leave the job after 6 months, a year, whatever, is that money still yours? It doesn't, okay, that makes sense. And that's it, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jane. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you just went up. There it is. Only takes one hit, as I found when I advanced yours, too. Okay, our final speaker, and then we'll get into discussion and questions. But our final speaker is Pamela Perrin, who's a well-known pension policy expert and also a recovering ERISA lawyer. She is currently which believe me, being an ERISA lawyer for a while makes you want to overhaul the pension system. Pamela is currently policy director for the Initiative on Financial Security at the Aspen Institute, and is formerly did pension policy with the Urban Institute, where she worked quite a bit with Gene Sterling, and they've co-authored the report and proposal that Pamela will talk about today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very happy to be here, and I think I'll start out by admitting that I'm the contrarian here, that I do think it's premature for the U.S. to mandate private pension saving, and so my talk is going to be about my reasons why not. The first is that unlike Australia and the UK, we have a substantial social insurance system in this country that provides disability insurance, life insurance for dependents, and individual and survivor income in old age that's generally not available in the private sector. Social Security provides the bedrock security we all need to protect ourselves against the vicissitudes of life. It is mandatory, it is paid for by employers and employees, and it is valuable. For a typical retiree, retirement income from Social Security is the equivalent of a savings account of almost $250,000. Second, our private system for saving, which is intended to provide the cushion on top of Social Security, really doesn't do a very good job. The system we now have is more about saving on taxes rather than saving. It's poorly distributed, it's inefficient and expensive, and it's overly complicated. In my view, it is really too soon to throw up our hands and conclude that people are the problem for our dismal rate of personal saving. Let's try first to fix our voluntary system. That should be our first priority. So how can we go about doing that? That's the subject of the paper that Jean Sturley of the Urban Institute and I just published. Our source of inspiration is the proposed set of pension reforms in the UK. So what is the UK trying to do? First, it made its Social Security system more like ours by making it more generous, fairer to women, and more widely available. Second, the UK concluded that for all the reasons we know well here, the system of voluntary employer plans wasn't working. They also had a system, much like the auto-IRA proposals of today, that employees not covered by a plan have an IRA-type plan open for them. Well, what they found was poor coverage in the voluntary employer plan market, and they also found that many of the stakeholder, what I call IRAs, we had millions of accounts with little or no money in them. So, beginning in 2012, the UK hopes to have a new system in place in which employers must enroll workers earning more than about $10,000 a year automatically into a workplace plan, or if no equivalent plan is available, into a personal savings account, much like an IRA. Employers can keep their current plans if they provide equivalent benefits. Employees are required to contribute at around 4% of earnings between roughly $10,000 and $65,000 a year. Employers must provide a 3% match, and the government adds 1% more in the form of tax relief. So the annual contribution is roughly 8% of pay. Savings cannot be touched before age 55 and must be annuitized by age 75. Up to 25% can be taken as a tax-free lump sum. Individuals with only small accumulations can take them as a lump sum, but it's taxable. And if an individual dies before age 75, before having accessed their savings, their dependents get a pension or lump sum from those accumulations. So let's now turn to our current U.S. system for saving. We often hear about 401k plans, but it turns out there are lots of them in our current system. There's a whole family of plans basically for every type of employer: corporate employers, nonprofit employers, governmental employers, and small employers. So employers have a lot of choice. That leads to a lot of complexity. Each family of plans has different rules, and it's the joy of being an ERISA lawyer is life just keeps getting more complicated. Every year, Congress helps us out. So basically, I've concluded that our current 401k system is too complicated and irrational. It discourages employers from sponsoring plans and employees from saving. We can and should do better. In Jean and my view, a sensible system for 401k type saving should be built on 4 principles. First, universality. Everyone should have the same opportunity to save no matter who their employer is. Second, equity. Low and moderate income workers should have real incentives to save and not just tax incentives that don't work. Income adequacy. The goal in terms of designing plans should really be to increase the retirement assets for low and moderate income Americans. And simplicity. We need simple plan designs that lower the cost of saving and increase the return to workers. So this is what Jean and I propose to do. We took the British model and we grafted it onto similar rootstock already available in the U.S. There is a plan called the Simple that was created in the late 1990s for small employers. Our plan is called the Super Simple, and it's intended to be the basic saving plan in the U.S. for all employers. For years, we've tried to raise pension coverage in this country by creating plans that would be attractive to employers. Well, we're not doing that here. We've created a plan instead that is employee-centric. That is, it is designed to increase the assets at retirement available to low and moderate income workers. So the Super Simple, like today's simple plans, uses a raise the floor plan design where all workers are entitled to a minimum contribution. Employers can have today's standard 401k plan if they wish, but the only other alternative would be the Super Simple. And here's how it's structured. The Super Simple is available to all employers. It is not mandatory. We are retaining the voluntary employer-based system. All workers, except very short-term employees, for those who earn under $5,000 a year, are automatically covered and enrolled. There are no testing requirements for participation, there are no tests for discrimination, and there is no permitted disparity or cross-testing. There are no ACP or ADP tests. There are no top-heavy tests, and there are no vesting schedules. There are also no 5500s, which is the annual reporting form for pension plans. All reporting is done through the income tax system. The Super Simple makes government workers and employers partners in building more assets for retirement. First, for workers, it includes a minimum contribution through auto-enrollment. We suggest a 4% of pay initial contribution, rising to 8% through annual or biannual increases, up to a maximum of about 10% as a default contribution. Workers could always choose to save more or less. Second, as in the UK and today's simple plans, employers are required to contribute, either through matching or across-the-board contributions. We suggest an initial 3% of pay contribution or any matching contribution that achieves the same end. The employer contribution is fully vested and uniform. We realize that many employers, particularly small employers, will be resistant to contributing. We know this is already an issue with matching contributions in auto-enrollment plans. But we think this plan design has two important features to help persuade employers to participate. First, the Super Simple, with almost no choices, requires no testing or expensive compliance consultants. Dollars from an employer's benefits budget that used to go to the compliance industry can now go into workers' accounts. So in the end, employers may be spending the same amount on benefits as they did before. Second, we raise the ceiling on contribution for highly paid workers. Because we have a raise the floor plan design that gives all workers a basic contribution, we eliminate the lower the ceiling design that standard 401k plans are built on that often limit how much high-paid employees can save. In the Super Simple, all workers can contribute as much as they like, up to the annual maximum minus any employer contribution. That means, for example, that management in 2008 could individually contribute up to $46,000 minus the employer contribution, and no testing would be required. Third, there would be government matching contributions delivered through the tax system for low and moderate income workers that replace today's savers credit. We suggest 20% of the first $2,000 or 1% of the first $20,000 in wages. Finally, we suggest some new features for the Super Simple. We believe it's time to reconsider today's FICA tax rules for 401k contributions. Today the rule is that employer, but not employee contributions are exempt. We think a good argument could be made to reverse that treatment as an incentive for low and moderate income workers to save. Second, we'd lock up all employer and government contributions until retirement, and this again reverses the current rule, while allowing workers access to their own saving under limitations similar to today's. We believe the Super Simple satisfies most of our principles. It's much more universal because it provides more workers with a convenient opportunity to save for retirement. It is fair. Lower income workers receive at least the same rate of contribution and match as higher paid workers. It is adequate, or at least it's striving for income adequacy, because it gives lower income workers real, relevant incentives to save and leverages their contributions through employer and government contributions. And it's simple. But by itself, it is not going to turn around our close to negative personal savings rate. As good as a Super Simple is, we need more than just one new plan. We need a more sensible system for saving. Most people save too little because they start saving too late. Like every other good habit, saving is learned best when learned early, and that can reinforce a mindset towards saving that persists throughout life. So in closing, I'd like to introduce you briefly to a new system for saving that we've developed at the Initiative on Financial Security. It's available in our red book, which we finally call George, in our packets outside. Our system is called Savings for Life, and it envisions a lifetime of saving through the private sector with government incentives for low and moderate income Americans. It includes 4 products that helps Americans achieve major life goals. Child accounts to build assets for a successful transition to adulthood. Home accounts to build better borrowers through matched down payment savings accounts. America's IRA to replicate the benefits of 401k or Super Simple saving for those with no plan at work. And Security Plus annuities to give retirees an opportunity to use their savings to buy an additional layer of Social Security type income that lasts for the remainder of their lives. These proposals have been vetted by Industry for Sustainability. They are easy to understand and designed with consumer protections. Their cost is just a modest fraction of the tax subsidies we already spend on those that don't need them. The need for financial security begins at birth and doesn't end till death. Before we impose a mandatory savings regime, let's give Americans a lifelong system for financial security with the Super Simple and the Savings for Life proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Let's see if I can actually. Oops.
I'm just going to put these out.
Trying to turn the light off here. There we go. So we can get everyone up here if they'd like without too much light in their eyes. Okay, well, thank you. Let's turn to some discussion and questions from you all, and I'd like to get that rolling by asking each of the speakers if they could just say a little bit more about what they would, how they would handle, or how Australia handles, and how these proposals would handle a couple groups that seem to be the most difficult to cover in the U.S. right now, which is if you look at who's covered or not by employer plans today, two of the toughest groups, which are fairly large, about a third of the workforce, are folks who are part-time, temporary, contingent, or self-employed workers, as well as payroll employees in very small companies. In other words, where you work at the local dry cleaners or a place that has fewer than 5 or 10 employees. And I'm wondering how Australia, maybe that's I'm sure in part the 10% that's not part of the system, but here it would be much more than 10% are self-employed, part-time, contingent, temporary workers, and also, as I said, the people in very small businesses. Gary, how does Australia? Are those kind of workers in the superannuation system, or?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the self-employed are actually outside of those numbers. Those numbers actually were only applicable to employed workforce. So the reason it's not close to 100% would be, I think, entirely statistical, that is, and very short part-time. So people that are highly casualised, very short part-time, self-employed outside of the system and are subject to tax incentives. The tax incentives are very substantial, and 80% of people are not covered, which is exactly my point about why tax incentives don't work. So the self-employed people have very substantial encouragement to be part of the system and choose not to. Now, I don't think you can do too much about that as part of a pensions or superannuation system. I mean, I think there are obviously big needs in various segments of the society. The biggest need is the people that don't appear on the statistics at all, and then after them, people that appear in various other statistical groups, such as working women that have large chunks of their working life outside of the system, and so on. But we can't solve all the problems of a society with one set of policies. If we're confining ourselves to pension, retirement income system, we've really been focused on people who are working people, not self-employed people. But and as to the very short part-time, I wouldn't exclude anyone. I mean, if I was designing that system, I would simply say, see, the argument was, for very short-term people, the administration costs eat up the benefit. But that's only so because you never let them get a substantial stake in the system. If you include everyone from day one, so that every time they walk onto a workplace, they get a contribution made on their behalf, pretty soon they've got enough to cover that problem of a small account balance covering the costs. So I wouldn't exclude any employed person. I think you have to rely on tax incentives for the self-employed. It's sort of it's a separate issue, the definition of who's a self-employed person and taxed accordingly, and who's an employed person. And obviously that's a blurred area with a whole range of other problems, but to a bigger topic than for today.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The better the portability, the more efficient it would be to allow those temporary contingent part-time people to
get a stake in the system.
Yeah, Pamela, do you can Super Simple accommodate these sort of part-time, temporary, very small businesses, etc.?
Oh, I think it.
You might want to use the. Sorry, you have to share
Sure.
with Jane.
I think it could, and I think that's one of the reasons why we made it super simple, so that an employer would have a turnkey plan that is very cost-free and easy to run. I think, so in a way, that's designed to help with the coverage problem. But we also realize that not every employer, your local dry cleaner, is not going to want to have a pension plan for its employees. And so that's the rationale for America's IRA, that we tried to beef up that product so it does a better job on a voluntary basis through government matching contributions for people who would probably never be covered by a plan at work. I don't think this is on.
You're right.
Jane?
Yeah, I just want to, one thing that I just want to make clear, that it doesn't seem to be out there. It's not just low, middle, nobody can retire with a 401k plan right now, okay? I mean, because of the ridiculous ceilings. And one major area where we do agree is get rid of this stupid discrimination crap, okay? Pardon my French. But if you're making it impossible for somebody to contribute 10% of their income because somehow it would discriminate against the lower paid, that's a totally counterintuitive idea. The other thing, and maybe you guys could comment on this, I think that the fact that small employers are going along with this, I mean, people say, well, no, that's impossible. They must pay them less. But I don't think so. I think even our median wage is lower compared to some of the other advanced countries. I also understand that the employers went to the Australian Supreme Court to try to fight it, and they lost. So I'm trying to anticipate, hey, let's go for mandates. What the hell? What do we have to lose? Would it go to the Supreme Court? Would employers win? I don't know. Do we have the same laws? You're a lawyer. What do you think?
Can I just say something about
Oh, yeah,
incentives?
maybe.
I just want to say something about incentives that appear to work. Lower paid people in the main are women, and most of them work part-time, and while the average weekly earnings for a male full-time is a bit over $50,000, most women are actually earning about $12,000 to $15,000 because they're part-time workers. So where we have had some incentives that appear to have worked, first is the $1,000 contribution from the government if you put in $1,000. You get the $1,000 on the basis of having an income of $28,000 or less, and it tapers then all the way down to a bit more than average weekly male earnings, which 70% of people never earn. So it's very generous, and it began really with the government trying to say it was doing something for the lower paid, and it has worked because the industry superannuation funds went and promoted it to their members to say to them, hey, this is the best deal you're ever going to get from a government ever in your life. And then one year they changed it from 1,000 to 1,500, so it became an even better deal. And the interesting thing is that there is an industry fund called HESTA. Andrew over here is one of the trustees of that fund. It's for health workers and community workers, mainly women, and it is the fund in Australia that has the most people getting the 1,000 from the government into their 1,000 account. So I think it does prove that it can work at that level. The matter also of the spouse contribution has somewhat similar things, but I think it's probably a bit more attractive to middle and higher income earners than it is for lower paid workers. But it means that the partner who's working puts in $1,000, is it $1,000? Or can they put in up to $3,000? I can't remember. But they can put in a certain amount and then they get a very good tax break on that. But if you're in the lower income area and paying a fairly low rate, it doesn't really work for you.
Okay, so it's like, on that constitutional question, I don't think it would be too much of a problem, although it may need to be characterized as a tax, which wouldn't help it politically. But certainly, there's social and Social Security requires a mandatory employer payment for essentially the same purpose as superannuation. Please identify yourself. Where you're from, and Norm.
Norman Stein, agent for Senate National, works at the Pension Rights Center. I had a couple of questions for Jane, and I guess and one question for Pamela. For Jane, I applaud the mandatory your suggestion that there be mandatory contributions, and I think that's something that's largely missing from a lot of discussion about 401ks. I did have two concerns about what you said, though. One is the 10 times final salary seems to me to be very high, particularly since finals, if you're looking at age 50, when you say you'd have to contribute 48%, your final salary really effectively in terms of spending power is half of what your true final salary is, because you're putting away half. All right, so you're actually talking about, in a sense, 20 times what your effective salary is if you're saving 48%. And that would give, I believe, even with unfavorable annuity purchase rates, more than 100% replacement rate, which does seem excessive. The second thing I wanted to mention, if somebody could put $100,000 a year into a 401k plan, I don't think we have to worry about them. And there's a tremendous tax cost, loss in revenue. And one of the things, the plan that Teresa Ghilarducci developed, points out that we're spending a lot of money, and the money is going not to people who really need help to save for retirement. For Pamela, I just had one. Where it's interesting your response primarily is the second of those points. And for Pamela, my question is, I agree that these accounts should be locked into retirement. But it seems to me, since I began teaching and studying pension almost 25 years ago, that there's been almost a consensus among people who think seriously about pensions that that should happen. And after 25 years, every time it's brought up, people say, well, politically that's impossible because it's people's money, they put it in, and we just can't require them to do that. And I just wonder what the politics, how you see the politics working out to allow us to include what I think you're right is absolutely essential if we're going to have an effective retirement policy.
I didn't understand the first question, and I don't want to admit that I don't understand things. So can I just answer the second one?
That's all I wanted to do. The first one was
Too many numbers.
The first one may be too much math for us this
Where's
morning.
my eyes were?
Okay.
Let me, yeah, I'm glad you asked about that 100,000 thing. I mean, you know, Lewis Black has this wonderful phrase, the Republican Party is the party of bad ideas, and the Democratic Party is the party of no ideas. I mean, unfortunately, we have succumbed to this no spending. Yes, here's a tax cut, spend, go to Walmart, yes. Make all these Chinese manufacturers rich that are making stuff that, you know. No, we need to save. And one of the tragedies of the mortgage situation that we're facing right now, the slide that Mavis showed in the beginning, we got a huge problem. We have a housing problem. We have a situation where people have been encouraged to borrow against their savings. Right now, 1/3 of all cars purchased in California is through a mortgage, home equity loan. Hello? You're borrowing against an appreciating asset to buy a depreciating asset. And what I love about the Australian system is they get people to think, whoa, I gotta treat my house with care. And for the most part, I believe the folks that took advantage of those savings weren't rich people who just happened to have 100 grand in the bank. It's, you know what? I ought to sell my home, move to a smaller place, stick that money in my retirement account. So, yeah, it's not just the fat cats go, oh goody, here's a little break. It's, you know, it's people who go, oh my God, I got to think about saving instead of spending.
Norm, I think
Need to turn it.
what we're trying to do is turn the usual system over on its head, because today employee savings in a 401k plan are basically locked up until age 55, whereas you can have a provision, you know, the 2-year, 5-year rule, and people can waltz in and get their employer's contribution. And our rationale here is that if we are mandating that employers contribute and we're offering tax dollars, that's a good argument for why those funds should be preserved until retirement. But we also know that workers, as an incentive to save, want to have access to their savings in the event of an emergency. So we're just trying to align those rules with what essentially would be better practice.
That's what the Australians do, right? If it's severe hardship, they can have the money.
One thing I'd just reinforce in Norman's question, but one of his questions was this notion of, you know, how of the limit, you know, for the tax favored saving. Because one thing you do have to keep in mind as part of the context here we didn't mention is that currently, you know, the federal government spends about, in other words, incentives for retirement saving are now one of the federal government's very largest programs, one of the 5 largest, and it's, you know, over $125 billion a year. And of that spending to incent retirement savings, 2/3 of that money goes to the top 10% of earners. So we're already spending a huge amount of money to encourage high-income people to save for retirement. And so it partly becomes, you know, a fiscal trade-off in the end when you're really in Congress, because, you know, we already have a saver's credit, right? But it's very, you know, which provides a tax credit for low-income savers, but it's not refundable. And although it was extended in the Pension Protection Act, you know, last year, it was not made refundable, meaning that you have to have an income tax liability in order to get an incentive from that. So Congress is saying today we can't afford to give low-income people any retirement saving incentive. And so, you know, we do have to think twice about the trade-offs between increasing the tax incentives for the wealthy compared to, what we need at the bottom. So there is a, trade-off there. I just wanted to highlight. Yes.
I'm Virginia Reno. I'm with the National Academy of Social Insurance, and my question is about the Australian system. And I guess it's, it seems to me the real test of a good retirement system is how well does it actually deliver the money in retirement. And so my question is, what kind of experience do you have so far with superannuation in terms of annuitization? Do people, I realize it's early for that. It hasn't been in place that long. Certainly not over a working lifetime. But are people taking the annuity? Are they opting out of the annuity? A couple more questions on that. Is this annuity subject to the means test of your age pension if people take it? And if people don't take an annuity and they die, does the money go to their heirs? How does this all work?
I know.
So this was for those of you who didn't hear it, it was a question about how the annuitization works in the Australian system, and how it, if it's integrated, with the old age pension, the one that's sort of like our Social Security that underlies.
So we had a situation where it used to be a lump sum that was paid. That was in the old system and in the early part of the present system. It has changed somewhat. There is an amount that for a long time people could take in very good tax circumstances. Now, I think whatever you do it in very good tax circumstances. But the encouragement is towards the annuity, and the industry funds promote this. We actually have our own products, and the funds themselves badge them to their own fund, because if you're a construction worker and you've been in the construction workers fund, you want to get your annuity from the construction workers fund. That's the logic behind it. And so this sort of thing is growing, but you've got to realise that our system is really very young, and it will not work itself out until people have had minimum 9% over a whole working life, and really best case scenario is some 15 to 20 years on from now. But people do have quite significant balances. I'm personally not opposed to some people being encouraged to take a part of their money as a lump sum. If, for example, you were a late starter and you still have some mortgage on your house, it's probably a good idea to think about clearing that away. A lot of people also, ordinary people do not have fantastic views about what they should do with their life. In my experience, people want to have a new car, they want to do up the bathroom, and they want to take a holiday. And that doesn't seem to me to be, really something that one should scream about and say, that you're ruining the whole system because of that. Now, there is connection between the age pension and what people get. There's a kind of free area. In other words, that you have a certain amount of income that you can get that is not counted to diminish the state pension. And it's reasonably fair, and it's all based on, I think, average weekly earnings people and below. And those people, if they are encouraged, and certainly I know in several funds that I've been associated with, that there is encouragement for people to take what might be considered to be quite a small annuity, but it covers that whole tax-free area. There's also an extremely generous assets test, and of the people who are in retirement, I think I said that there's 82% of them get the state pension in whole or in part, and some people set up themselves where they actually get, or a partnership would get somewhere about $55,000 a year, which is more than one person earning average weekly male earnings in retirement, and it would all be tax-free, which it's not when you're working, and they've got a $1 right within the age pension system, and that guarantees them all these incredible things that are then passed on to all retirees, namely they pay less for their rates, they pay less for their water, they pay less for their electricity, they even get free broadband now, and the most important thing is they get the healthcare card, which gives them access to very cheap pharmaceuticals. And while a lot of people, it does for health, all health things, they go free to the doctor and they get very cheap pharmaceuticals. And it is people aged, it's 1 to 5, as well as those people who are in retirement who spend, or where money is most spent on pharmaceuticals, and it makes a huge difference. And so, although it's not meshed completely in the way, that's part of the unfinished business, I think it's got to be looked at more and reviewed. There's quite a good mesh already between the state pension and what people are getting out of their retirement savings. And budget figures say that after the next 25 years, that instead of being 82% of people who are on the state pension, of whom 70% of that 82% rely entirely on the age pension, that it will move down to 50-50. So only about 50% of people will be, not 18%, being self-funded, but within the 50%, only about 25% of them will be relying entirely on the age pension. Now, figures don't always work out the way they say, but it's an indication of how it is working, and I think will continue to work. But we need to always be aware that you've got to keep looking at the two systems and making them work together.
Okay, that's great. Well, we actually have another, we're kind of running over time and have another event in here as well, I believe at noon or 12:15. So if there's, I think there might have been 1 or 2 other questions, you could come up and ask them of the speakers up here if you'd like, but I want to give everyone a chance to, to escape, from here, and wanted to thank you all for coming and thank our speakers for covering a lot of ground in this time.